Thank you so much, Mr. Franklin, for coming. We were happy to have you on Africa Uncensored.
Thank you for having me.
The results of the recently concluded elections in the US came as a big shock to many. Why do you think that is so?
Well, I didn't think that Donald Trump was going to win either. I think that the reason for such shock that Donald Trump won was that the polls did not indicate the groundswell of opinion in many of the states. There are people who were going to come out and actually vote for him. The polls did not accurately describe how many white women would be actually coming out and voting for Donald Trump. What the polls did not indicate was the depth of hatred there is and discouragement perhaps in the United States, the anger about Washington, D.C. In other words, about the elites in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So Donald Trump's campaign, which essentially was not driven by any policies, and he ended up defining the entire election campaign as one of personality, of outrageous statements, and also of not having to be accountable for what he was saying.
What do you think his win means for Africa?
Well, I think for Africa, the jury is very much out. There are different aspects of U.S. Policy towards Africa. That is the security policy, which is probably not going to change, particularly in the Horn of Africa, and as it pertains to Kenya. In other words, we will still have the U.S. government financing the security forces in this region. We will still have drones, probably more drone strikes, and we will still have more war on terror. Now, the economics of American policy, or what the United States does, is Africa is very much a sideshow. Africa is not a big deal for American business. We have businesses in Kenya that are headquartered here because they have to be someplace in East Africa. You know, private companies do not just abandon parts of the world. What we don't have in this part of Africa, or elsewhere for that matter, are the factories that used to operate, the Colgates, the Kodaks, the General Motors, although we have an assembly plant. We do not have job creation, and we probably never will. We're seeing American companies who are opening up regional offices. There is a possibility that a large defense contractor and also infrastructure developer, which is supposed to be building a 6-lane or 8-lane superhighway from Mombasa inland, may not come because Donald Trump is talking about rebuilding American infrastructure, which requires a lot of rebuilding and a lot of money. I don't see Bechtel, the big US firm, coming here to build roads when it can be building roads in the United States. And everyone expects that those kind of infrastructure projects in America will be starting fairly quickly.
What is his relationship with the African leaders?
I don't think he has any relationship with African leaders. He hasn't thought about African leaders. I don't think he has any policy towards Africa at all. He is a rather blatant example of how Africa does not count in the United States. It's a place where you donate money. That is, Africa is a place with starving children and children who need vaccines and things of that nature. But everything that Donald Trump has said about foreign assistance is not good for many of the recipients in Africa. I think in Kenya, just the last 3 weeks has demonstrated how money comes in and doesn't seem to get out to people. The United States has a $1 billion annual program of grants to various and sundry recipients in Kenya. That's all programmed money already through USAID, and I don't see it being shut off anytime soon. One aspect of the United States that many people in America don't realize is how much of our foreign assistance stays at home. How much money goes to financing US NGOs, US companies that make condoms, for example. And the notion that somehow the United States is going to get involved with some sort of war with China, I mean, an economic war over commerce in Africa, is really sort of a thing for pundits to talk about. It eats up airtime.
How do you think he's going to handle the war on terror?
I think the war on terror can only get worse, particularly in this part of the world. There are some analysts who are pointing out that he has correctly identified the Obama-Clinton foreign policy as having caused a lot of the problems in the Middle East. Something that I have also spoken about in the media, where we have no policy about what do we want to do about Assad in Syria. We withdrew from Iraq, now we're backing back into Iraq. We overthrew Gaddafi and had no plan for what happens when he is thrown out of power and killed. Yemen is a perfect example of a country where things seem to be okay. A rebel movement overthrew the government, and now we are fighting everybody. And our allies, the Saudis, are bombing everybody using our weapons. None of this is very good for how people perceive the United States. I don't think any of that is really going to stop, particularly in places like Yemen, also in Somalia. These are sideshows. Many people do not have a clue where they are. And I'm not entirely certain that Donald Trump is going to pay any attention to what goes on in a country like Somalia that hasn't had a government since '91. As for Kenya, it seems rather obvious that as long as the situation is maintained and doesn't get out of control, the US government will continue financing, training, assisting the Kenyan security forces, regardless of the results or the lack of results.
Do you think he's actually going to implement his policies?
He has not, in fact, mentioned policies. This is not a joke. I'm saying this in all honesty. In 1 week, in less than a week since the election, he seems to be backtracking on a lot of his policies, whether it's repealing Obamacare and things of that nature. He has no comprehensive or cohesive policies about foreign affairs, even about trade. And also, you know, I think that the importance of American trade initiatives to Kenya and elsewhere, yes, it is important for some, but these are not the kind of initiatives that grow the economy.
How do you think his policy on bringing back the immigrants back to Africa going to affect the economic situation in Africa?
It's very difficult to deport millions of people. And if we look at Kenya, I think notionally, there are 30,000 Kenyans living illegally in the United States. That means they are breaking the law. Whether they come back or not, I don't know how they can round them up. And if they do round them up, it will, of course, it seems to me, it will cause some problem with the remittances that come to their families. But there is a problem, obviously, when you have people living illegally, and it has security implications. So in fact, you might see any number of illegal African migrants being sent back as a security measure.
And what about the war on global warming? He didn't seem to have a concrete...
He doesn't believe that there is global warming. And even there are many mainstream conservatives and Republicans who have started to believe that, yes, something is wrong. Something is, in fact, very wrong with the world's weather, with the climate. I wasn't necessarily convinced until a few years ago, but I've also watched in my 35 years here in Kenya how the weather patterns have changed.
And do you think he'll come to Kenya sometime?
I don't see Donald Trump coming to Kenya during his presidency, unless it's to go on safari. But other than that, what's the point?
What is your view on the statement that he will not take any salary when he's in office?
I think it's just wonderful that he's not taking any salary. Apparently he doesn't need the money. I believe, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think that President Kenyatta collects his salary either. Does he? I don't think so. In other words, President Kenyatta established a policy that he doesn't need the salary that we would pay him. So Donald Trump is following Kenyatta's lead, isn't he?
What about his views on the lesbian and the gay community?
Donald Trump has never had these hardline positions on abortion, on gay, lesbian rights. In many ways, he's a Democrat liberal from New York City. He does not represent the conservative Republicans who also wanted to run for president. I don't even know who he represents right now, except he does represent very angry people who wanted to go out and make a statement that they were tired They were fed up and they didn't want anything more to do with people in Washington or the elites, the same elite where Donald Trump grew up in. So in other words, I'm not certain what will be happening.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin, for speaking to us.
Thank you.
For these and more of our stories, please visit our website, africauncensored.net.